Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and Stephen and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. And I thought what would be best is we'll just do a quick run through of the AP's decision desk, who we are and what we do on election nights, and then turn it over for questions. I'd really like to have a conversation with the group, answer your questions and, address the things that you're thinking about rather than just hear, Stephen and I speak to a slide deck for a whole hour. So we're going to run through this hopefully pretty quick, give you the basics, the 10,000-foot view of the AP decision desk and what we do, and then get into questions, and looking forward to that conversation. So start with what we do. We declare winners, and that's what we're all about at the decision desk. We're gonna have a conversation next week about our vote count with API. But what we are doing on election night is declaring winners. And when we declare a winner, it's our final word. We don't make projections at the Associated Press. We don't make predictions. There are no apparent winners or likely winners when we make a race call. Our AP News alerts say that the person is won. And so that's the standard that we hold ourselves to. And it's a really high standard because it's different than a projection. It's different than a likely winner. We do this a lot. On November 3rd and the days afterward, we'll declare winners in more than 7,000 races, which means in the primaries, if you include uncontesteds, we've already called close to 15,000 races this year alone. And we start at the White House and we go all the way down the ballot to every race for state legislature across the country. And the team that does that is led by Stephen Olemacher. He's our Washington-based decision editor. And he'll take you through who we are at the decision desk and a little bit more about what we do. Stephen?
Thanks, David. So to make all those calls, we have a team of 60 analysts that will declare all the winners. We have state-based race callers who are responsible for every election in their state. And they are helped by teams of analysts in Washington who focus on specific races, such as those for president, Senate, and governor, or U.S. House races, or the thousands of down ticket races. Our race callers in each state prepare for months ahead of Election Day, digging into all the research generated by the AP's election research staff. They tap the expertise of the AP's political and government reporters, as well as all of the news outlets in each of our states. They understand the election rules and the recount requirements unique to their state, and they stay up to date on any changes to the election laws. They have data at their fingertips, on every county and district, how they voted in past elections, and they have to know how each state and county processes, counts, and releases the results of early and absentee ballots as well. So when does the AP decide to call a race? To put it simply, we declare a winner once we determine that the trailing candidate will not catch the leader. How do we do that? We take into account every piece of information we have about an election. We study the vote history for every state, county, and district. And as I said, we have that information at our fingertips on election night. We closely follow the news. We follow the money. We pay close attention to pre-election polls. Do we expect an increase in mail ballots in the state? Has the state changed the rules? Have the courts? We track this too. The point is we never make a race call in isolation. We always take everything we know into account. On election night, we have many tools to help us declare the winners. We start with AP VoteCast, which is our replacement for the exit poll. As many of you might have heard, working with the NORC at the University of Chicago, the AP developed a new survey approach designed specifically to account for the steady rise in voters who cast their ballots before Election Day. In 2016, 42% of the American electorate cast their ballots before Election Day. And we believe that more than half will do so in 2020, and with the pandemic, it could be well over half. We did not anticipate a pandemic when we developed AP VoteCast, but it is well suited for this moment. After the polls close, we start getting the AP vote count, which fuels our election models. At the end of the day, the voters, through the vote count, always have the final say. In close races, we pay special attention to the votes counted after Election Day. This is not new. Every state adds votes to their count after Election Day. Some add a few, others add thousands. The only difference this year is that we will have to deal with this issue in more states. David?
So we work really closely together. As Stephen said, it's a big team. We don't look at any one single piece of information. alone, and we don't expect anyone to make a race call for the races at the top of the ticket alone. So when we're calling a race for Senate or governor or president, or the big call about who wins the White House, that's a team decision at the decision desk. And we've talked about it, we've explored all the options, we've looked at all the scenarios, and we've really, sort of red teamed it out to make sure that, the whole team believes in the call, and that we're convinced that we've reached that moment, like Stephen described, where the trailing candidates no longer have a path to victory. Now, we don't call every race, obviously. Some races are really closely contested. Most often races are too early to call. And when we say too early to call, that means there's still data coming in. There's more votes to be counted. There's a question about how many votes might be outstanding. And so we say that a race is too early to call when there's more information that we don't yet have that we should be considering before we make that decision. Sometimes a race does, though, end up too close to call. And that's when the point where the vote count has essentially reached its end and it's too close. It might be in a state where there's a mandatory recount law and the race is inside that margin. It might be a race where the vote count is completed, but officials can't say for certain that there's no more ballots outstanding left to be counted. That's something that will come into play this year in states that have postmark deadlines and could be counting ballots that trickle in for a long time. So when the vote count nears its end and there's no clear winner, we'll say formally with an AP News alert that the race is too close to call. So we've had to make some changes because of the pandemic. But as Stephen noted a little bit earlier, a lot of the things that we're seeing because of the pandemic, we've seen before. We're just now seeing them in many more places. Stephen?
Yeah, so since the start of the pandemic, we have seen a large increase in the number of mail ballots in state primaries. And of course, we expect this trend to continue in the general election. Now, this is important because mail ballots take longer to process than votes cast at neighborhood polling places. Officials have to open the envelopes. They have to make sure the voter is registered and has filled out the correct ballot for their neighborhood. And they have to do any security checks required by law, such as matching a signature or checking an affidavit. Only then can the ballot be counted. States that allow counties to start processing mail ballots well before Election Day are much more likely to have a smoother, quicker count on election night. States that don't allow counties to start processing mail ballots until Election Day, or maybe the day before, are much more likely to take days or even weeks to finish counting. In these states, it could take longer to declare a winner in some close races. Again, this is not new. We have years of experience declaring winners in states that have extended vote counts. And as David said, the only difference this year is that we will have to deal with this issue in more states. And to help, the AP has extensive research on early and absentee voting. We have historical data for every state and county. For the current election, we will get daily updates on the number of ballots requested and returned in each state. And on election night, we'll have real-time data on whether these advance votes are following the same trends as the votes cast on election day. Is a candidate winning both the advance vote and the election day vote, or is there a split? Now I'm going to turn it back over to David so we can take some questions.
Just a nice AP photo Q&A slide, but I'm going to actually turn the presentation off and start up my video, and looking forward to talking to all of you. What things can we tell you about what we do? Or what questions do you have about election night and AP's race calls? Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much to you both. We're already having some questions come in the chat, and I'll just run through the list. So first, how specifically do you calculate for the number of outstanding ballots that are coming in through the mail or drop boxes or some other way?
So I can take that one. Our vote count team, tracks every day up until election day, the number of ballots requested, the number of ballots returned. We talk to election officials on election day and on election night, constantly asking them, how many ballots do you have left to count? And this is not always an exact science. It goes back to what David had said before. Sometimes races are too early to call because we don't have good information on how many ballots are left outstanding. In other states, we have great information. So we are constantly asking that question. And especially, as David said, some states have postmark requirements. That means that you can, as long as the mail ballot's postmarked by election day, it might be able to show up as late as Friday or the next Monday, or in some states even longer. And we have to take that into account.
Thanks. So in terms thinking about the reporting aspect question, will you continue to use the quote percent precincts reporting as your default this year for returns, or will there be some kind of percent of votes counted metric, even if it's incomplete, imperfect? How are you going to communicate and kind of display how votes are being counted in this period?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. And I'm going to hopefully give not too long of an answer. Let's start with precincts reporting, which is still in a lot of states a really good way to assess how far along the vote count is. But in some other states, it can be deceptive. A precinct might be reporting, but not all of the votes from that precinct. That's particularly, that happens in particular in places where they count same day vote separately from votes cast in advance. There's also situations in some states where one precinct might contain all of the advance vote. And so if that single precinct reports, it can paint a distorted picture of how much vote is left to be counted. So we struggle with this, and we do our best to be transparent about where, what the rules are in each state and each place. In some places, we use what are called proportional precincts. And we have to do this in places where vote centers exist, for example, that allows, you might have a county where voters from any precinct can cast their ballot early at a vote center, or even on the same day in a vote center in multiple places. So the precincts don't necessarily align anymore with where these vote centers are, and that makes it difficult. In that case, we'll use an estimate we call proportional precincts that tries to represent, the number for precincts reporting. In addition to this, for all statewide races, we produce what we call the outstanding vote, or the expected vote percentage. And in all of our feeds and all of AP's elections maps, for statewide races, we show this figure as well. And this is our estimate of the amount of vote that is left to be counted, or the amount of vote that has been counted so far. And it's an estimate, and we start with an estimate. We start with, what we expect the vote to be for a statewide race. And we're informed by a lot of the same things that Stephen discussed about race calling. We look at the total number of advance votes, for example. We look at the historical trends over time. We look at what turnout was like in the previous election, in the primaries. And then as the vote starts to come in, we're able to refine that estimate. We use the same statistical models that we use to help us call races to help refine that estimate. So we provide both, and all of our maps have explainers in more detail about both. And we explain how we do both on our website at ap.org. And I'm gonna ask Lauren Easton or Patrick Max from AP, who are on this call, maybe to post a link to that site where we explain the difference between precincts reporting and outstanding vote in the chat, so everyone has access to that.
Thanks, David. Similar to how you ended that in terms of information that you're making publicly available about this. Are you doing, the question is, are you doing stories that track with the sessions like the one we're having today, a piece on how to call races, for example, that could be made available, or could you or other experts on your team be made available so that local reporters can kind of localize this story for their own audiences?
Yeah, absolutely. So Lauren, if you want to go ahead and post a couple of other links in the chat as well. At ap.org, we have a lot of detailed backgrounders about what we do and how we do it. And that's a great reference and a great place to start. If any of you would like to talk to anyone from AP, you can reach out to Lauren or Patrick, and I'm sure we can get their email addresses in the chat as well. And they can connect you with the right person at AP to talk to about what we're doing for your coverage. Additionally, we have a lot of explanatory reporting at AP. And you can look in AP Newsroom, or you can look at apnews.com and click on, and I'm sure we can get those links posted as well, to where we're putting all this explanatory work. And that's also a great reference as you know, and something that that you can rely on.
Thanks, and we'll follow up with an email to all the attendees today with the links that are in the chat and some additional information from our speakers. Cool. Then moving on to kind of the more technical questions. When voter turnout surges, does that make your ability to call more difficult because past models are less helpful, or how does turnout factor into decisions?
I can take that one. Not necessarily. So one of the things that we do, you know, we compare the current race to a past race. We have a size race, a base race, but then we have a turnout projection, you know, to see, you know, how much, you know, how we expect turnout to differ. And, you know, an obvious size race to compare this election to is the last presidential election, right? Because presidential elections are different than midterms. Turnout is much higher in a presidential year. And we will have projections for turnout, you know, on what we expect to see in 2020 compared to 2016. When votes come in and show a surge and a much higher turnout, our models tell us so. I mean, it literally tracks every single time we get a vote into our system. Our models do something called the average number of votes per precinct reporting calculation. It does this calculation every single time votes come in, starts at the county level, feeds all the way up to the state. So it actually tells us. So as we get farther along into the night and we're waiting on maybe some of the bigger counties to come in, that's often how the vote count works, is that some of the larger, more urban counties come in late. You know, okay, what can I, you know, how many votes can I expect in this county? I can look at the whole rest of the state and say, look, turnout's, you know, 20% higher than it was in 2016. You know, I could probably expect it to be somewhere in that neighborhood. So absolutely. I mean, it can be a little bit challenging because, you know, turnout can be different in different counties, obviously, but we are able to literally track that throughout the night as it happens.
Thanks. Two kind of related questions, so I'll try and weave them together. Do you have a particular concern that a huge number of ballots might come in well after the election? The question asker here is thinking of recent examples like the congressional election in Massachusetts 4th District, where 3,000 mailed ballots were found some days after the election. Will you be considering this possibility in your decisions on or following the election day? And then somewhat related, and you touched on a little bit, but do you have information on the expected numbers of folks voting in person, whether that's earlier on election day or voting by absentee mail ballot? And how does that information impact reporting and decision-making?
Yeah, two good questions. Stephen, I'll take the first one and then maybe you can take the second.
Sure.
You know, I wouldn't necessarily call it a concern, right? Like we have to play the hand that we're dealt. You know, we don't get to set the rules at the AP. We have to just, you know, we're the umpire that gets called in to I guess, you know, look at those rules and apply them. So one of the things so I wouldn't call it a concern, but it is something that on which we are intensely focused. Stephen mentioned at the top, we have a dedicated team of election researchers. And you know, they send us updates several times a day. This law has changed. This rule has changed. And one of the rules that we're looking at most closely this year is when will states begin to process ballots, and when will they start to count them? And that's going to really, really help us. A state that gets started well in advance of Election Day processing their ballots is going to have a better handle on what's outstanding, and then obviously one that starts counting earlier will likely finish sooner than one that waits until polls close to start both processes. So that's definitely something that that we're paying a lot of close attention to. Stephen also mentioned how we get and adjust to information that we get over the course of the night. So in the statewide races, for example, we'll begin to see early in the night, even with incomplete returns, sort of what the pattern of voting is, right? And in smaller counties, how many votes were same day? How many votes were advance? If many counties in a state say, we're done for the night, but we're not done counting, that's a pretty good indication that there's a lot of votes outstanding and we need to be much more cautious about making a call in a statewide race. So we try to take in as much information as we can ahead of time to understand sort of what the rules are what games that will be being played by election officials. That's a terrible analogy. Election officials don't play games, but I'm stumbling with my umpire analogy there. But the point is, we want to understand exactly what we're dealing with in terms of what the rules are, and then we adjust as we start to get information. And we're always looking for things that are red flags, always looking for signs that we need to be more cautious, always looking for that piece of information that we don't know about that's going to preclude us from getting to that point where we know a trailing candidate can't catch the leader. Stephen?
So, on election night, as far as getting information about how many people have voted either before election day or on election day, and how those votes are going, we do get really good information on that. And some of that's based on the reports we get before election day. How many mail ballots have been requested? How many have been returned? How many people have voted early in person as well, which is also a large segment of the electorate. Then on election night, we have AP Votecast, which has been giving us really good information on the size of the advance vote. I use that term advance to sort of encompass all of the votes cast before election day. And we used that in 2018, and it gave us incredibly accurate numbers for the share of the electorate that voted before election day and the share of the electorate that voted on election day. We're able to compare those estimates that we get on election night with the data afterward to see that. Just as importantly, we can see how they voted, right? We can actually look and see for trends. As I went back before, I said, is the same candidate winning both the election day vote and the advance vote, or is there a split? And then as we get more votes in and counties identify, absentee votes for us, we can double check those numbers to see if in fact those trends are playing out. So at the end of the night, we hope to have, if things go well, and they don't always go well, we always prepare for the unexpected. We get as much information as we can from every county on what you're counting, what you have counted, what you have left. What kind of votes do you have left? Are you still counting the election day precinct votes? Or are you waiting to count on, are you still processing mail ballots? Do you have provisional ballots? That's another piece of the puzzle that we always have to take into account. Provisional ballots are almost never counted on election night. And some states have quite a few of them. I will tell you, in Ohio, there's going to be well over 100,000 provisional ballots. There always is. And they will count eventually 80% of them. So we have to take into account all those things and know that. And so it's constantly asking more questions. And hopefully, in some states, we're able to get better information than others. But that's what we work off of. And so we come in with expectations, and then we prepare for the unexpected and watch as the data come in, and we adjust for that.
Stephen makes a really good point that I'd like to amplify there is, we're not sitting in isolation just working with data feeds and numbers on a screen. This is a reporting exercise. AP will have more than 5,000, I think roughly 5,000 reporters out across the country on election night in almost every county election office, reporting center, places where we need to potentially get information and collect votes. And so if we have questions, we go out and we do the reporting. And that's an incredibly intensive exercise. One of my colleagues at AP likes to say it's the biggest act of journalism, ever, every 4 years. All the number of reporters who are working on a single story at the same moment. But if we need information, we don't guess or we don't speculate. We go try to find it. And if we don't get it and we need it, we don't make a call until we do.
Thanks, guys. Want to spend a little bit time thinking about, Stephen, you mentioned all the provisional ballots in Ohio, and so certainly this year we're seeing a lot of state differences in terms of how elections are being administered when votes are counted. In terms of, if ballots are postmarked on election day, do they count up to the 3rd, the 6th, or the 12th? Or states have various standards on that still may change, and so I'm thinking. A question is, how is that going to influence particularly calls related to the presidential election, which a lot of folks are focused on, thinking about not just election night, but potentially election week or longer in terms of both those election administration decisions, follow-up litigation, et cetera. How is that informing how you, not just making decisions, but reporting on this process publicly in terms of what's going on behind the scenes? Why don't we know the president, who the president is on November 3rd, potentially?
So we will do this the same way we've done past elections. And so I don't want to downplay, the unexpected things that might happen to us on election night, but we'll handle them the same way we've always handled them. And that is, for provisional ballots, in a close race, and I can go back, 2004 is a great example. In Ohio was the deciding state, and we were unable to declare the winner on election night between Kerry and Bush. We had reporters all over Ohio that Wednesday morning checking with counties everywhere to find out how many provisional ballots you had left to count. And when we came to a conclusion at about 11 a.m. on Wednesday morning that there simply were not enough ballots left for Kerry to catch Bush, we declared Bush the winner of Ohio and reelected president. And so we'll continue to do that. And I don't want to downplay this, but this is, we've done this before, but we've done it successfully because we've really paid attention to it. Another example was in 2006 in the Virginia Senate race, where Senator Webb, actually the control of Senate was at play. And it came all the way down to Virginia, whether the Republicans were going to keep control or the Democrats were going to win control. And again, we sent reporters out all over the state of Virginia to track down how many votes in each town and county were available to count. And when we determined that there were not enough for Senator Allen to catch Jim Webb, we declared Jim Webb the winner. Jim Webb is now the president. So these things have happened in the past, and we pay really special attention to them. And we're just going to do it even more so this time. Or I shouldn't say more so, to do it in more states this time is what I mean.
The presidential race gets all the attention, and rightly so. The White House is the focal point of so much of politics in America. But election night, election week's actually not new in the United States. I don't know how many of you might be on the call from California. It takes a long time to count up all the ballots in California. It's a really big state. And so we're used to our decision team. We always live election week. That's not new for us. We are, having to work through all the races down the ballot. And it takes time to count up all those votes in places that do primarily have advanced voting as their method of conducting an election. And so again, that's not new. And it's something that we're going to have to apply in more states. But people say, "Are you getting ready for election week this year?" Like we always do. Stephen and I will be really busy come election day. Capital E, capital D. But we don't get to rest for a long time after that because there's whatever that number is, 7,000 races that need to get called. And we don't stop until we're done. We're right there with election officials, and they don't stop counting until they're done. And it's going to take a while is not a new thing.
In 2018, the first day I took off after Election Day was Thanksgiving Day. If I can take a day off before Thanksgiving this year, that'll be great. If not, it's just another year.
That's telling, Stephen. Just as a somewhat of a follow-up on that, what would you recommend reporters that are not necessarily tracking the vote counting and these decisions as closely, potentially just because of all of the capacity issues that they have? How should they talk about the fact that elections have always taken, or in many places have taken longer than just election night? What's different this year that should be included in that reporting? How can we communicate to our audiences that one, this is normal, but two, that this is, here are the factors in play here?
Yeah, it's a good question. Go ahead, Stephen. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, part of it is just because it's taking a long time to count the votes, that by itself doesn't necessarily mean something bad is happening. And the fact that this has happened in other places and in other states. You're right. If we don't know who the president is by Thursday and Friday, as David had said, there's going to be a lot of attention on that. People are going to want to know, and so I guess the best way to explain that is that that by itself doesn't necessarily mean something's going on. There'll be plenty of attention and plenty of reporting to find out exactly what is happening, but just to know that not to be alarmist simply because a state is very close and a state is still counting votes. And to go back to one other thing that David said about that too is if we don't know who won an election, whether it's president, Senate, governor, or anything else on election night, it's not necessarily because the race is too close. It might just be too early, that we don't have enough data. Now go back to 2018 in Arizona. People might remember the Senate race there, where Martha McSally had about a 13,000 vote lead over Kirsten Sinema on election night. 6 days later, we declared Kirsten Sinema the winner, and she eventually won by more than 3 percentage points. That was not a race that was too close to call. It was simply too early to call while we were waiting for, by the way, an additional 700,000 votes in Arizona.
I think for local reporters, the number one thing you can do is know your rules and report the heck out of it and explain the heck out of it right now up through election day. What's taking place in your community? What's taking place in your state? How are the rules changing? How are they different this year? How are they the same this year? Do a lot of explanatory reporting, a lot of explanatory storytelling ahead of time. Make that part of your coverage. That to me is so much more important and interesting than horse race numbers. Telling the story of how voters are going to be able to do what they do on election day and in the days leading up with early voting is super important. So just do a lot of explanatory reporting about what's taking place in your communities, what's taking place in your state, and try to understand it as best you can so your readers and viewers can understand it.
And we will consume that news, by the way. We have a report that we have that shows, how every single state is processing, counting, and releasing their absentee and mail ballots. It is updated every time there's another court ruling that changes the rules in a state. And I get updates almost every day. And, in Michigan, there was an update. In Pennsylvania, there was an update. And these things are going to continue to happen up until election day. And as David said, report the heck out of it and explain it to people. Explain how this is going to affect things on election night and how it changes when they can vote.
Thanks. One more kind of combined question on this point before we get into some of the kind of technical aspects of your models. We got a few questions about that, but looking at some of these factors, and folks listed a few specific ones. So documented examples of ballot destruction, so maybe arson at a vote center. Thinking about changes in election rules. So, for example, the Pennsylvania's ruling in Pennsylvania about so-called naked ballots with lacking a secrecy envelope. How are those factors, or those considerations, or those potential uncertainties in terms of which votes get counted? Does that affect how you're modeling or projecting things, or thinking through the process of making decisions for some of those things that are unexpected or may change post the election or even after the election in terms of how you're making calls?
Yeah, happy to take this one. And the answer is absolutely it affects our thinking and it affects what we do, 100%. Now, this gets into that idea that we were talking about earlier of all the information that we need to make the assessment, as Stephen described, of can the trailing candidate catch the winner, right? So that's super important. And Stephen and I are going to be in the Washington Bureau, but this is where we really rely on our team. So we're going to have people in Pennsylvania, for example, who are focused just on Pennsylvania. They don't have to worry about the whole country. They just have to worry about the races in Pennsylvania and the rules in Pennsylvania and the laws in Pennsylvania. So our Pennsylvania race caller is going to be paying a lot of attention to that issue. About what's taking place with naked ballots and what the rule changes might be, and how that might be affecting things. And they're the person that we rely on to tell us, on the decision team, hey, we're looking at these numbers, but here's that unknown piece of information that we don't have. If it's a sort of a weird situation, ballot destruction, arson, those are the types of things, sort of the odd wrinkles that absolutely we take into consideration. And again, I come back to the idea that, if a race is if all the information is in and the race is too close to call, we don't call the race. And so if there's a chance that ballots that were destroyed, it might be recast. I mean, first off, we have to figure out how the state plans to handle that situation. That's a reporting question. We need to go out and do that research. Then we'll apply that to our decision making. If there's the chance that those naked ballots, a court could say, no, you have to count them, and those will be added to the total, and that total number might change the shape of a race. we hold off. We don't call the race, and we'll explain why we're not doing that. So, all of these things, that's why it's not a computer algorithm that makes race calls. It's not just numbers that come in. We do reporting. We have to understand it. And it's why it's not just a group of people in the Washington Bureau who do this. It's why we put people and have people. We benefit from AP's footprint of having reporters and journalists in every state in the country. We rely on our race callers who are based in these places, understand these places. And it's part of that big team effort. We couldn't do it any other way.
Great. So a couple questions building from that answer about the human aspect of these decisions and not just modeling. First, thinking about the framing of when the trailing candidate no longer has possibility to get enough votes to catch the winner. Question is that based on a statistical model assigning a percentage of outstanding votes to each candidate based on your data research, or is it sort of technical, like this person trails by 5,000 votes and there's 4,900 left to count? So what does that aspect look like?
I can take that one. So it's all those things, right? So we go back to the whole notion that we use every piece of information that we have available to us to declare a winner. So, we'll look at this. And so we actually, as the vote count proceeds and we have a projection or an estimate of the total outstanding vote, we look at that and we see, okay, how much of that outstanding vote does the trailing candidate need to win in order to catch the lead? And as that percentage gets higher and higher, you start looking around in places where they're still counting votes. And if that candidate is not getting that percentage anywhere in any of those other counties, or hasn't too. So this is where we get into things like vote history and the progress of the votes that we have right now. And it also gets into some of the knowledge and expertise that we have. I grew up in Ohio, so I know Ohio really well. And I'll tell you, Cuyahoga County, big county, Cleveland, also includes a lot of suburbs. I know how the vote comes in Cuyahoga County. I know that the votes that first come in Cuyahoga County tend to be from the suburbs and tend to favor Republicans more than the later votes. I know that the last votes that come in Cuyahoga County are from Cleveland. And that is a heavily Democratic city. And that I know that those are not going to favor the Republican candidate. They're going to favor the Democrat. And so it's really everything. It is the algorithm. It is the statistical certainty, but it's also all the information that we know, about, where this candidate is doing well. We'll have counties where there is no vote. So then we look back and see, okay, how did Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump do in those counties last time? How did Barack Obama and Romney do in those counties? How did the last governor's race? We have all of this data to go back and check and see. And we know, and we follow patterns. If a county has gone 60-40 Republican for the last 4 elections, it's probably not going to go 60-40 for the Democrats this time. So we take every bit of that information into account when we're trying to declare a winner in those cases.
Thanks. A couple things in terms of folks, local reporters having access to your reporting and the information that you're seeing. One, will AP VoteCast data be shared or reported on before Election Day? 2, are there opportunities for local journalists to gain insight from AP's research on vote counting, on these race calling? How do you work with maybe non-AP journalists in that sense, or share information and data? And how could folks get access to that information if they wanted?
Sure. So I'll talk about VoteCast at the start. I'll probably actually take both of these. So VoteCast data starts to become available at 5 p.m. On Election Day. This is election research. We're conducting our polling, our surveys of the electorate right up until the moment polls close. So we start to put out some information initially at 5 p.m. It just describes the shape of the electorate, how many voters think the country is headed in the wrong direction, the right direction, how many voters are men, how many are women. We don't release any data about candidate choice until polls close in a state. And even then, we don't release the top line number per state. It's always, what the candidate choice was within a subgroup, among men, among people who thought the country is headed in the wrong direction, those types of things. So no data from VoteCast is available before 5 p.m. on Election Day. Probably the best way to, to access our data if you're not an AP customer is, through our reporting. We've got some really great interactives that you can look at that, shows a slice of what we do. Lauren, maybe we can throw up the link to the Advanced Vote Interactive as well. And that's one way to do it. For those of you who are AP elections customers, and I'm guessing the vast majority of you are, because this is, how we tell the story of Election Day is through our vote count. You can work with us and work with the elections team to get access to the research that we have and make available.
Great. Building from that, if you want to, if folks aren't AP customers, here's a question that's teeing you up for a sales pitch. One question I have is I'd love to hear about why the AP process is superior to things like Decision Desk, so that on election night we can explain to reporters who are watching Twitter and seeing earlier calls the difference.
That's a great question. I have a lot of respect for our colleagues at the networks that also do decisions. We work very closely with Fox News, for example. They're one of our primary customers for AP Votecast, but all of our decision desks are different. They're separate. We're not collaborating, on election night in any way. We're all looking at the data independently. And we, on our decision desk, we actually don't pay attention to what the others are doing on election night. And that's not a sign of disrespect. We don't want to be influenced. We want to look at the information cleanly. We want to do our reporting. We want to think about our decisions. And so we focus on what we do. A question about, why you should trust AP. I mean, gosh, we've been doing this since 1848. The cooperative was founded in 1846. And 2 years later, the first presidential came along since we founded the cooperative, and we started counting the vote. This is integral to who we are as a company. It's integral to who we are as journalists. Stephen's job is not to be the decision editor 1 year out of 4. Stephen's job is he's the decision editor. It's a full-time assignment. Emily Swanson, who's our director of public opinion research, doesn't do polling on the side. She does polling full-time for the Associated Press. Our elections research team, they don't research other things. They're not part of the research library at AP and do elections, just in primary season and around the GE. We devote a significant amount of resources because this is something that's integral to who we are and what we care about. We have the experience to do this. We've done it before. We've done it for many, many years. And we invest everything that we need to do. And I know, because I see the spreadsheets, I write the checks, that we need to be right on election night and tell the full story. And that's why I think you can count on us.
Thanks. One follow-up question from an earlier response. Was it stated, and I think that's much earlier in terms of the precincts reporting question, was it stated whether that percent of expected votes will be transparent everywhere or only in some races?
Every statewide race.
Every statewide race, okay. Thinking of to your previous answer about other folks making calls, in that environment of uncertainty, how would you recommend journalists that are seeing maybe multiple conflicting calls, candidates that are saying that they've won when that hasn't been firmly established, other uncertainties? How would you recommend reporters respond and behave in that environment, or potentially when we have results in some states, maybe we know who wins Florida on election night for the presidential race, but not Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. How should reporters think about that dynamic?
Yeah, well, the two different questions, and they're pretty different questions. So the first one is, I think in those types of situations where, and this is how we deal with it at AP, we just state the facts very plainly. So-and-so has declared victory, the trailing candidate has not conceded, and AP hasn't called the race. Or there will be times where a candidate declares victory and a concession has been made, and we report those two things, but we always say that we haven't called the race, and here's why. We state the facts plainly and clearly, and try to explain, the reasoning behind what we're doing, in our decision desk. And so I think that honestly is the best solution. Lay the facts out, explain what's taking place. So-and-so's declared victory, but the trailing candidate hasn't conceded and the race hasn't been called. And election officials say that there's many more votes outstanding. Use those facts to put the race in context. That's the thing that I can suggest to you. If someone attempts to declare victory before we've made a call or before the outcome is known, outline the reasons why, outline the facts of that moment, of that circumstance. And I think that is, that's really the best tool in our arsenal as journalists, is to go out and do the reporting and then explain what we find in that reporting.
David makes a really good point. It's important to note that a declaration of victory or even a concession is not legally binding. And so it's happened before where candidates have declared victory and then turned out that they did not win. And there have actually been cases in which candidates have conceded and did not actually lose. So just a great example, if you go back to 2000, some of you might remember the big recount in Florida in 2000 on election night. The Associated Press did not declare George W. Bush the president on election night in 2000. A lot of other folks did. We had a reporter, a former colleague of ours, who was embedded with the Bush campaign with all these reporters from all around the world. And he said that it was, at the time, it was really uncomfortable because everyone wanted to know, the AP hasn't called us, everybody else has called it, what are we supposed to write? Right? Because all of these news organizations who are our members and our customers, they rely on us to tell them who won and to tell them, what to write in this matter. And he said, well, they say it's too close to call. There's too many votes left out. And he said, looking back on that years later, he said, it might've been uncomfortable in the moment, but looking back on it, it was probably one of the proudest moments he ever had at the AP because we did the right thing. We decided it was too close to call and we needed to wait.
One of the things that we've tried to do, Stephen and I, since we moved into our current roles on the decision desk, is increase the level of transparency around those decisions. We used to say the race is too close to call, period, and stop. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is increase the amount of reporting and explanatory work around why a race is too close to call and put that information on the wire and share that information with our customers to know and explain the context. The race is too close to call because of this, or more often than not, it's the race is too early to call because of this. And it might be because the race is 5,000 votes between them and there's 100,000 provisionals left to be counted, or only 30% of the vote is in, or it's any number of reasons why. We've talked about some of them on this call. But when we get to sort of milestone moments where we're saying that the race is too early to call or too close to call, or why haven't we taken an action, we're trying our best to be more clear about why that is, and that's something that you should hold us to account on, because I think it's core. We want to be transparent about what we're doing.
Thanks. I think you talked about this in a couple different ways, in a couple different answers, but a follow-up into the kind of premature declarations of victories by candidates. In addition to outstanding votes, what other numbers or pieces of context will be available to help us when AP hasn't called a race yet? How else can reporters think about what other pieces of information to share that goes into, when a declaration is made?
Yeah, so Stephen, why don't you maybe talk about how we think about recounts, because the laws in each state around recounts are something that definitely comes into play there as well.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So it's it's not just that there are X number of votes left to be counted. Sometimes it's where they are, right? Are they in an area of the state where the trailing candidate is doing well and might catch up? Also, if we're not ready to call a race, that is very close. We follow the recount laws in every state. So some states, not all, but some states have what we call mandatory recounts. Recounts are automatic if the margin between the top two candidates is within a certain range. Now, in the vast majority of states, not all again, that margin is 1/2 of 1 percentage point, or 0.5% of the total votes cast. In other states, they don't have mandatory recounts, but maybe they have what we call non-mandatory recounts or candidate requested recounts. These are recounts that the candidate requests and usually has to pay for. And in those states, they are sometimes they can only request them if the margin between the top two candidates is within a certain range. Again, the most common margin is at 0.5%. But in some states there is no margin required. And in most races, this isn't much of an issue for a candidate to request and pay for a recount. Losing candidates don't have a lot of money left over. And it's not easy to raise money to pay for a recount once you've lost. In a presidential election, of course, that's not going to be an issue. There will be plenty of money to pay for any kind of battle that might happen after Election Day. So we pay close attention to those things. And so if a race is within the mandatory recount range or is likely to slip into the mandatory recount range, we will not call it. The state has decided through their laws that they need to take a second look at the numbers before they're willing to declare a winner. And we will follow that. It's a little bit less certain when you talk about non-mandatory recounts. And what I've done is we've done a lot of research on this. And so if there is no margin required on a race, and you can request and pay for a recount, in other words, regardless of what the margin is, we use a standard that's 0.5%. If the margin between the two candidates is likely to stay larger than 0.5%, we'll go ahead and call the race. And that's based on several factors. One factor is the vast majority of states employ this number in some form, either for mandatory or non-mandatory recounts. Also, there have been 31 statewide recounts since Florida in 2000. 3 of them have led to an election being overturned. All 3 of those elections were decided by hundreds of votes, not thousands. And the biggest shift between the top 2 candidates in any of those recounts was 0.1 percentage point. There is no precedent for a recount overturning an election when the margin is 0.5 percentage point or more, once all of the initial votes are counted.
That's a great example of the type of research and the minutia that we get into. And I should say Stephen gets into to be ready for election night.
Thanks. I think we have time for 2 last questions that we've already got in, but if folks have additional questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll try to follow up with the response after the call. But a question thinking about the language that you use. So 2 points, why use the phrase declare victory or called the race rather than projected winner? Thinking about potentially when results are certified in that aspect. And then the second is, I lost it. So let's start with that one. Apologies.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's the standard that we hold ourselves to. We don't want an out. We want to hold ourselves to the highest possible standard. And we want to be certain, and so that's how we've set this up for ourselves. That's what we hold ourselves to do. We're looking for certainty, and when we find it, we make a call. Thanks.
And then a question from my colleague, John. From your 30,000 foot vantage, how do you feel about the level and amount of explanatory reporting on the kind of election week dynamic and other aspects of election administration? Is it enough relative to previous election years? Are there any states informed by your own research and modeling where you see that there's a higher likelihood of uncertainty and thus a greater need for explanatory reporting?
I don't think we do enough explanatory reporting. That's just my personal opinion. I think that's one of the most important things that we can do right now. My only fear about this is that all this attention is a little bit, we need to be prepared for everything. But one of the outcomes is an election that goes very well and is handled very smoothly. We have seen, particularly in states where they did their election, further into the pandemic and had more time to adapt to the changes brought on by the coronavirus, very, very well run elections. Massachusetts ran a great election. Florida ran a great state primary. So one of the outcomes is a really smooth night. Another outcome is really, really difficult night. And it might vary from state to state and place to place based on what the voters decide. And that's the cool thing about elections, right? Is like we can do all our predictive modeling, we can take all the polls we want ahead of time, but at the end of the night, or the beginning of the night, actually, I should say, we start looking to find out what the voters have done. And I think that trying to get ahead of them, there lie the dragons. So let them have their say, and we'll go out and cover what they do. And then if we do that, we'll be in good shape.
And David's absolutely right about that. I do want to make sure, because some folks might be from Massachusetts. Massachusetts went very well, except for one town. And sometimes when a very close race, we had a very close primary for a congressional seat, and sometimes it only takes one town to mess everything up. So we are prepared for that.
Well, thank you both so much. We're just about at the 3 o'clock hour Eastern time. I just want to thank you both so much for taking the time this afternoon to share a bit about what you're doing, but then really dive into folks' questions. I'm sure we could continue this conversation for hours and hours, but lots of good stuff here. I just want to give a plug. This is the first in a series of 4 events that we're doing with the Associated Press. Same time, same place next week. We'll be joined again by David Scott and your colleague Christina Cassidy. And David, I don't know if you want to just give a little pitch for what folks can expect next week. I've dropped the link in the chat if you haven't registered to get tickets for next week's event.
We're going to talk more about voting, and we're going to talk about how we count the vote at AP, the work that we do to actually, add up and tabulate all the votes. But I think, Christina is going to be a great resource talking about all the ways that voting laws have changed and sort of the threats to the potential, I should say, for threats to our voting system. So, today was about how we call races. We kind of did this in reverse. Maybe we should have done how we do the vote count first and then how we call races. But next week's all about voting and and how we tabulate the vote and how election officials are dealing with running a vote operation, an election during the pandemic.
Awesome. And then the following week, October 7th, we'll be joined by Julie Pace and Emily Swanson to talk about polling and using voter surveys to tell good stories. And then finally, October 14th, we'll talk about election misinformation with Amanda Barrett and Karen Mahadir. So please, if you haven't signed up for those, do. We know they'll be well worth it. One final plug, if you're not in the Trusted Elections Network and you'd like to join, please visit the website that I just dropped in the chat. And you can sign up to get more insight like this. But with that, we'll follow up to everyone with an email about some of the things we heard today, some of the resources that were dropped in the chat. But with that, I want to thank everybody for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Thanks so much.